this conversation about Jewish life in the city, Antwerp and London. In this series of conversations about contemporary Antwerp and its architecture, the issue of Jewish life in the city raises the question not only of what is contemporary, but also what the term local can mean in a large metropolitan centre situated at the crossroads of a complex web of infrastructure reaching far and wide across Europe and beyond. The two ideas are connected. The contemporary situation, our present, consists not only of our plans for the future, but also, and perhaps principally, of the already existing, both temporary and enduring. Usually, these two states are mutually exclusive, but for Jewish communities around the world, this duality between the temporary and the enduring, the transient and the permanent, is an ongoing reality. This contained duality is what challenges the notion of the local and the role that this concept can play in a city, any city, but especially Antwerp and London. Who can be autochthonous or indigenous to such a place? And what could the preconditions for this description possibly be? And yet the term allochthon, originally a geological term to describe a body of rock that has been moved along a fault at a great distance from its place of origin, emerges in anthropological discussions of Antwerp citizens and their various communities. It is used to identify and analyse the othering and exclusion of migrants and post-migrants and the diminishing of strangers and alien influences. The first recorded Jewish presence in Antwerp dates back to the 13th century, but persecutions following the Black Death epidemic in the middle of the 14th century destroyed the community. Under Spanish rule during the 16th century, refugees from the Iberian Peninsula settled first in Antwerp, but were soon driven out by the Spanish with their Inquisition to Amsterdam. By the end of the 18th century, it was possible for Jews to settle again in Antwerp, and in 1815, Antwerp was incorporated into the Netherlands, where all religions, including Judaism, were granted equality. The Jewish communities that exist in Antwerp today date back to this starting point, when the 100 or so Jews living in the city were legally recognised as a community. Towards the end of the century, the diamond industry became established in the district around the central station. By 1920, around 16,000 Jews lived in Antwerp, and on the eve of the Second World War, the number is estimated to have been around 50,000, 10% of whom were Belgian nationals. By the end of the war and the destruction of the Holocaust, only 800 were left. They were those who'd been hidden away, such as Leon Fuchs, who we will hear more about later. 21st century Antwerp is home to more than 30 different Jewish communities, including various Hassidic groups who make up around 40% of the Jewish inhabitants of the city. London's Jewish population has been subject to a similar ebb and flow, and some of the first Antwerp Jews arrived as refugees from Britain in the 13th century. As in Belgium, it wasn't until the 19th century that a Jewish presence in Britain was legalised, following a gradual process of acceptance into the British establishment through knighthoods, mayorships, and ultimately the ascension of Benjamin Disraeli, a baptised Jew, to Prime Minister in 1868. The majority of British Jews live in London, around 10 times as many as in Antwerp, and there are around 125 Jewish community institutions, synagogues, yeshivot, and Hebrew schools within Greater London. The Heredia Orthodox Jewish community is one of the most visible and well-known in the city. It remains within a tight geographic area centred on 4 of the Borough of Hackney's northern wards, Casanova, Lordship, New River and Springfield. According to the 2011 census, 7% of the population of Hackney are Haredi, half of whom are under 19 years old. The discussion today originates in reflection on 2 cities with a long historical trading relationship with each other, Antwerp and London. And the speakers from each city bring different perspectives to the conversation. From London, Adam Khan presents a consultation and design process for a housing project located in Hackney's Haredi district. This was enabled through the expert advice of Tom Stebbing, who has deep connections with the local Haredi community. When in the context of London, we look at how architects respond to Jewish culture and life. In Antwerp, we look at the other side. Kaat Verdickt presents the work of Jewish architects building in the city during the 20th century and into the 21st century, and raises questions about how Jewish culture can permeate architectural production. Alain Teilelbaum deepens this perspective through his work with Project 2 and his own experiences as a Jewish architect in the city as he reflects on the presence of Antwerp's Diamond Quarter.
So thank you, Helen, for this introduction and this opportunity to share with you all a work in progress and still in very early stages. Through my PhD, which, as you said, I finished, I've learned so far that hidden or untold stories are often very interesting and worthwhile listening to. And also that value is to be found in societal change influenced or fueled by migrations. Architects with a diverse or another identity are often present in Western society. They are present, but not visible as such. How come and why is that so? So far, I have found the ideas of Theodor Adorno on the resistance towards the non-identical helpful. What we don't know, we don't see, and are inclined to ignore. Thus far, I have observed three interesting cases on Jewish architecture and architects in Antwerp. The first case is on modernist architects in the 30s, of which our VAI archive collection holds bits and pieces of their work, and we keep them in our archive. The second case dates from the 60s, and there we have the complete and untouched and also unedited archive of a Jewish architect called Leon Fuchs. The third case I observed in the 90s is that of the progressive architectural developments of Jewish entrepreneur Alain and Mar, which will be left out of the scope of our research project. What I would like to learn in this research project is if the architect takes up living culture to the new context and transforms this, yes or no, in his or her practice, and if yes, how? What are the tacit approaches in the migrant architect practice and the diversity introduced to architecture culture of the country one has moved to? Can we understand the language of forms and contents of the architect's work as a result of his changes of circumstances? And is there or isn't there an awareness of otherness? Also, is there a recognition of the architect's work as a dialogue between cultures? So far, two cases of cultural circles are detectable, but not research as such. So the VAI started a research project together with Professor Lara Schrijver of the University of Antwerp. This project investigates an underexposed and to some degree hidden history of Jewish modernist architects in Antwerp. While a few individuals of the 30s have been marginally included in the canon of modern architecture, we argue here that the particularities of an individual such as Leon Fuchs provides a foundation from which to explore both the hidden histories of these architects and their particular contribution to modernism. At the same time, the development of the profession is conditioned by specific commercial and cultural elements related to Jewish networks in the city. These include a strong presence of the diamond sector, which provided specific commissions to these architects, and a strong Jewish network that had need of synagogue and Jewish schools, amongst others. Architects working in Antwerp prior to the Second World War included Nachman Kaplansky, who came to Antwerp in 1925, and the Antwerp-born David Moret. Both worked for clients in the diamond industry and at times extended private commissions. Here we see 3 of the 15 huge and impressive large projects of David Moret built in the city center of Antwerp. Kaplansky, on the other hand, built up a practice from 1930 on, resulting in notable modernist buildings and high-quality dwellings, such as the Prince Albert residence along the Alain. The VAI also holds, as I said, archival material of Leon Fuchs, an Antwerp architect who has remained hidden in the histories of modern architecture in Antwerp. His work as a modern architect who was also embedded in various Jewish networks is exemplary for the culture of architecture in the 60s in Antwerp. His biography shows a palette of cultural undercurrents that reveal the inherent tensions of a period in architecture that sought to rebalance the radical visions of high modernists such as Le Corbusier, Mies van der Rohe, and Walter Gropius, amongst others. At VAI, we are still unpacking his work, which was in total in order, and reconstructing his career, his networks, clientele, and colleagues. Here is a reconstruction of his network with colleagues and persona. He was also the president of the Royal Society of Belgian Architects at a certain point in his career. And this is a reconstruction of his network of the projects that he realized only in Antwerp and in the vicinities of Antwerp. And at this moment, we counted 300 projects that he realized. Now, our goal is to realize an integrated project where research, heritage, and output can come together and that we can present to the public. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Kat. That's great. I think we'll just go straight on to Alain now, who's going to talk to us about the Diamond Quarter in Antwerp.
So we're talking about the architectural presence of the Jewish community in Antwerp. For that purpose, I'm going to take a closer look at the Diamond Quarter, probably the most potent manifestation of that presence. First, let's look at a few examples during the diaspora. This is Vienna's main synagogue. It's a richly decorated, surprising space that looks more like a theater. It's the only synagogue in Vienna that survived the Nazis. Why was that so? 50 years earlier, the Edict of Tolerance allowed Jews to practice their religion, but their houses of worship couldn't manifest themselves as such from the street. So the synagogue was built together with and hidden behind an apartment building. Therefore, the Nazis couldn't burn it without setting on fire the apartment building, and they refrained. This is France's oldest synagogue in Carpentras. Here, the Jews were also allowed to build a synagogue by the Pope, though with a limited footprint. Also, since he forbade that its presence be visible from the street, the synagogue was hidden behind a nondescript facade. In the Middle Ages, Sevilla was home to a thriving and prosperous Jewish community. The wealthy Jewish merchants built their houses around richly decorated inner courtyards. But from the street, they have deceitfully discreet facades. If you take a peek through a doorway, you can sometimes catch a glimpse of one of those hidden gardens of Eden. Spanish Jews, both before and after the Inquisition, had learned to hide both their riches and their faith. These are all examples of a rich inner universe that is shielded from the outside world as a survival mechanism. Now back to the Diamond Quarter. The Diamond Quarter is bordered by two streets, lined with 3- and 4-story buildings, that don't look very different from the other quiet streets in the surrounding urban fabric. But if you take a step back, you discover that those facades hide a dense cluster of mini skyscrapers of up to 15 stories, completely invisible from the street. The aerial photograph clearly shows that these ziggurat-like towers use successive setbacks to hide their nature. It shows an extremely dense high-rise city block in an urban fabric of low-rise, low-density blocks. This form gradually developed between the 1950s and 1980s, mostly thanks to lax city planning rules. The understanding with the authorities must have been that as long as what was built wasn't visible from the public domain, anything was possible. This mini Manhattan, unconsciously hiding from plain view, is the reason why I borrowed my title from Rem Koolhaas's book. The Diamond Quarter is concentrated in one meandering street. It's oriented exclusively inwards, towards that street. It completely turns its back on the aforementioned neighboring streets. This is partly due to security reasons. That one street is easily and permanently cordoned off by barriers, guarded by a police station, and under constant surveillance by cameras. Moreover, the streets it's connected to are quiet, with few inhabitants or passers-by. So, since it leads to nowhere, houses neither dwellings nor shops, and is guarded like a fortress, there is absolutely no incentive for any passerby to walk up that specific street. Finally, its bayonet shape gives the main central portion of the street an enclosed character. All these elements give the Diamond Quarter a very secluded character. It's a safe haven for the diamond merchants to walk around with briefcases full of diamonds, negotiate deals, gossip, and worship in the synagogue halfway up the street. So, Antwerp's Diamond Quarter gives us yet another example of a hidden, secluded, and rich interior world. I argue that this manifestation, or rather absence of manifestation, is not only born of necessity, but actually reveals an essential characteristic of Judaism. It's a culture where the most precious tenet, the one God, can't be named or represented in any way. Where the most precious place, the Holy of Holies, can't be seen or entered. Where the most cherished day of the week, the Sabbath, is defined by an absence of action. Louis Kahn told the story of the Roman legions who conquered Jerusalem and its famous temple, erected to that one all-powerful God, expecting to find Solomon's golden treasures. The moment they entered the Holy of Holies, he said, imagine their surprise when they found it was completely empty. In Judaism, the mystery of the sacred is revealed by hiding, by removing. Otherwise, idol worship is never far away. So, we have absence as manifestation of a deeper truth. That reminds me of my visit to Berlin's Jewish Museum, approximately 1 year after it was completed. Strangely, it still wasn't open to the public. Liebeskind's masterpiece, with its sloping floors, walls, and windows, turned out to be so impractical to house the museum's collection that the board had fired the director and they had to rethink their whole museum concept. In the meantime, I found that much publicized yet unreachable empty space was a very telling manifestation of the history of a Jewish community that had been completely wiped out. Absence as manifestation of a deeper truth.
Thank you, Alain. It's I think they were a very good combination, your presentation and Kat's, with some very powerful ideas. I'm going to ask Adam to speak now from the London side and from the side of making architecture for a Jewish community. And then Tom, and he will speak also of the work of Tom and possibly Muff Architecture Art, who worked in collaboration with him.
So I'm going to talk very briefly about Tower Court, a project in the London Borough of Hackney. And in many ways, it's here it is on the London map, as mentioned before, in the London Borough of Hackney. And close to Stamford Hill, an area with, I think, Europe's largest population of largest Heredia community. And in some ways, it's a kind of leafy suburb. But on the other hand, it has this kind of huge in terms of kind of overcrowding, desperate housing need, but and that's partly driven by this kind of need of the community to live, practically to live near the synagogues for the Sabbath. But I think there's a deeper kind of urbanity about that, and a kind of one also sees a kind of mutual self-help kind of things, and these things that are about kind of clustering and living together densely. And so the scheme actually is quite high density compared to the surrounding kind of leafy suburbs. And it's instigated by the London, I think the London Borough of Hackney, who are really quite an exemplary borough in, I think, the way they set up projects and the way they prepare for them. For example, in this case, by writing an excellent kind of brief in collaboration with the community and getting Tom on board very early to advise them and to advise us. And I think that set the scene really for a project which is, highly collaborative at every kind of level. So, our collaboration with the local authority and with the community, but I mean, amongst the design team, a very collaborative approach. So with Muff Architecture and Art, who, absolutely transcend any role description as kind of public realm or landscape. I mean, excellent master planners and completely involved in a kind of housing and sense of place. And then Daisy Froud, who's kind of, absolutely amazing engagement expert, who really works to kind of get behind the usual kind of slightly trite, kind of superficial tick box exercises of consultation and make that really genuine. And of course, Tom, who's an excellent sort of guide to navigating, this Heredia culture. And I guess one of the key features of this project is it's not a project actually for the Jewish community. It's social housing for all of the community. There are many communities in Hackney and around Stamford Hill. There are Somali communities and other, as typical of London, there are many communities. And one of the important features of the project was actually a kind of bringing together and a dialogue, because in this area, maybe many others, there is a certain element of kind of suspicion and mistrust between communities. I think, the Heredia community, as well as the non-Heredia community, maybe sometimes feel that the other side is always getting everything from the council. Everything's always for them, which is kind of unfounded, but those suspicions kind of abound and are indeed stoked up by some people. And so actually the process of design very much started with that kind of idea of breaking down those barriers and bringing together. I think it's interesting that when we got the job, it was described as we got the short straw. I think that's because there's a history of a failed project on this site. And also at the time, the Heredia community was described as that phrase of hard to reach, which is a kind of like now a slightly outdated phrase and really not that useful, because of course, no one's that hard to reach, and it just depends how you're doing the reaching. But I mean, we were lucky that we had Tom to kind of advise us and point us to the fact that, one of the features of the Heredia community is maybe they don't do bureaucracy so much. So the normal form filling, normal kind of quite heavily bureaucratic, institutionalized ways of doing engagement, might not have taken hold. So we just turned up on the Clapton Common here. We pitched up our stall, and lo and behold, we were, soon inundated with people incredibly generous with their time and their insights into and into kind of her needs and aspirations, and giving us very intimate details of kind of personal life. Actually, it was incredibly generous. And then, hugely, engaged in these workshops. I mean, usually one is sort of struggling to get people along and interested, and then here was completely enthusiastic. And here's Liza being shown how to design a kitchen properly. And then, that enthusiasm for the scheme, it even extends to young people who are here busy reading sort of leaflets on it. On the other hand, there was kind of returning residents who had lived in the block before it had been demolished, and for them it's a different kind of poignancy, I think, of coming to a site where they'd lived and it was all just rubble. And so they were kind of another very key part of the kind of design process. And actually, I mean, there's a story about that really, that actually we actually had to kind of slightly engineer those events at the beginning. And it sounds strange, but we engineered them so that they'll be on both days of the weekend, actually, so that you would get a day when there weren't so many Haredi Jewish people at the event. And now that may seem strange, but it's thinking there was that if you're a non-Haredi community person and you turn up an event and it's absolutely full of Haredi people in very visible, identifiable kind of costumes, it could lead to the perception, and it does in some people, oh, it's another one of those events that it's all for them and the council lays on everything for them. So this sort of trick of having, 2 days, one is a Sabbath and one's not, actually ensures you get a day. And there's not many Haredi people, so it's kind of opposite of what you'd normally do, which is trying to get people along to an event. Anyway, as the design process went on, that was easy to actually start having events that were kind of joined. And one of the things that came out of that, I mean, we were also lucky enough to visit people's houses. This is arranged by Tom, and this is incredibly useful, and start to learn about some of the particularities. And this is, for example, the need for a large library of religious books and a large table to study at, and not the need for TV. Now, we're working within the quite strict space standards of the London Housing Design Guide, which is jolly useful, but it's quite normative in that it gives you dimensions for a living room and how you can fit a TV in there, but it doesn't give you dimensions for children's play space or something like that. And then also when you start to design flats that are kind of 5-bedroom, 10-person flats, the use of the guide starts to break apart. And the more we were kind of countering these, specific needs, the more it became evident that actually these are quite you find them elsewhere. So it's no different really from artist friends who stick all the kids in one small bedroom in bunk beds so that they can actually free up a room for a studio, or a bunch of hipsters who don't have a TV, but they do have a massive record collection. So that actually these commonalities, rather than it being a kind of special case specific needs, actually it starts to be about how can one design these flats for a broader range of lifestyles and actually maybe more pertinent contemporary lifestyles. And that's kind of, so that's a kind of theme we could go on more about, but it's the kind of Joyce phrase really, like in the particular is found the universal. So here is a typical floor plan, and we're just going to see one of these large flats. These large flats are kind of absolutely, I guess, typical across continental Europe, but in UK, families tend to be housed in maisonettes or houses. A simplex flat on one floor is usually smaller than this. And so here's a plan, we're not going through in detail, but what are a few simple devices to allow within those strictures of the Housing Design Guide space standards to enable different lifestyles. In this case, a Haredi lifestyle. So bunching up the kids in the bunk rooms frees up a room that then can be used for religious study, allows you another table other than the dining room, for religious study, hallways that are wider than normal so that you can actually play in the hallway. And then, of course, the sukkah balcony, which we'll come to in a moment. I mean, even just sort of simple things, very straightforward things are like allowing interconnecting doors between rooms so that they can be opened up and used for festivals. making stairways wider, they can have a bookshelf up them, and making the circulation generous enough that it feels like a space you can actually do something. And so here's another, one of these visits where people were very generous and opened up their houses to show us. Here's a typical kind of sukkot structure, beautifully arranged inside, and that requires that the kind of an area where you can have sky above your head. And so here they are in simple kind of balconies, but obviously they have to be arranged, not stacked. And there's more to them. I would give a 2-hour lecture on a sukkot balcony, but and then here working with this economy of not being able to provide a huge balcony where the whole family can eat out. So here's a kind of nifty solution where the head of the household can have their head under the sky and the table can run into the house. And so it can accommodate that kind of flexibility. And then in terms of the spaces between the buildings, I mean, I think, Helen mentioned that there's half of the population, Heredia population in Hackney are under 19 years old. So there are large families and there's a large child yield. And that's a real interesting, fascinating challenge for high density living, because this is a born estate in London. It's a perfectly lovely estate, but it kind of shows you what happens in a typical courtyard. It's rather a beautiful amenity space to look at, but actually, doesn't provide for the kind of large number of children. So the courtyard, the spaces between the buildings here, working at this high density and this particularly high child density, have to work really, really hard. And so not just access, but play and sustainability. So here you can see the kind of footprint of the buildings, 4 mansion blocks at the head of Clapton Common. And you can see the way the buildings the courtyards can splay out at both ends. So buildings and the spaces between inflecting towards each other. Here you can see a more detailed version of that, opening out to the common quite kind of obviously on the south side, but also opening out to this road along the back to stop that becoming just a service alleyway. And then this kind of civic public realm extending into the buildings. So that's a view from the common looking into one of these kind of inflected spaces. And then, and this is kind of Muff's genius, we work so hard at the qualities of that public space to make it one sustainable, fantastic amenity, but also highly playable. So here's a set of sort of rain gardens down the middle with a playable landscape and some of the variety of those bridges, and bringing in a kind of craft and bespoke quality to a social rented housing scheme. Another piece of engineering actually is to ensure that each courtyard is mixed tenure and mixed community. There are perfectly good housing associations, that Jewish housing associations in Stamford Hill, but very often they're kind of effectively monocultural. And I think one of the amazing ambitions of this project is actually to bring together the community. So this is a neat bit of engineering that both by tenure, each courtyard has a mixture of tenures, that's social rent, shared ownership, which is kind of middle set, and private, but it also has a range of size of flats, so that it's not simply the preserve of kind of large families or something. And I think another amazing feature was these courtyards actually are publicly accessible and open, and I think that was a real achievement actually. And I think it's partly due to this finely considered idea of thresholds, the architecture making it work, but considering the kind of threat that the Jewish community is under, in the surrounding neighborhood, there's typically kind of guards on the schools and synagogues. I think this has been a really positive aspect, that actually the idea of gated or locked gated courtyards was rejected, and this idea of open public courtyards was completely supported. Just a couple of notes on the materiality. This is Paul Rudolph in Berlin, and I think this idea of housing as a kind of background, as a sort of deep dark background with moments of interest, but a background to planting and to life, was very present for us. And actually the housing, this is just a sketch of the sketches, are sort of as a kind of mountain. So having a kind of rather restrained quality, maybe a rather not quite monumental, but kind of like a mountain quality. And I think, so it feels like there's quite a kind of resonance and an affiliation to me between the kind of qualities that kind of we enjoy about housing as background, as reticent, as a background for life and planting, and maybe somewhere slightly kind of lost in time as well. And yeah, and it's on site now, and it's due to finish in about a year's time, but that's kind of render of looking at the mansion blocks, looking over Clapham Common. Great, thanks.
Brilliant, thank you so much, Adam. I mean, I think it's interesting to see these two sides, Antwerp and London, and very different takes on the subject of Jewish life in the city. And I know, I think there's some very interesting overlapping themes that we could discuss now. This issue of dialogue between different expectations and knowledges, between a negotiation with rules and how that's approached, and especially, and I think the theme that comes most to the fore is this tension between the public and the private, which I think everybody talked about in their presentations. And I was thinking that maybe we could start with that, and I'd like to ask Tom first to speak to the presentations, and maybe thinking about how this issue of discretion and hidden qualities that Kaat and Alain talked about, and that Adam unpacked in his discussion of the processes of making Tower Court.
Yeah, so Alain was very clear on the history and the reasons why Jewish life is often very discreet in the city. And we work both in Stamford Hill with the Heredia, but we also work with the Orthodox in Golders Green and North London, and sort of growing towards Boreham Wood, Elstree. And the more suburban London gets, the more almost invisible the Jewish community becomes, and they do, and it's that reverting to the tradition of just keeping yourself to yourself, not drawing attention to your buildings because they become targets, and that is still unfortunately the case even today. But in Stamford Hill, the fascinating thing is that because of the way the people choose to dress still, as they would have in the shtetls of 18th century Europe, there's no hiding. And what we've tried to do, and what Adam Khan and Muff just latched onto amazingly, was it's more about home life, family life, and once you start to understand it, it gives you architectural cues that make buildings even more beautiful, and using family life as a driver. There's also the case that as you talk more with the Heredia community, especially in Stamford Hill, their confidence comes out, and their drive to, you start to understand what makes them tick. And it's the whole process with Adam Khan, the very analog process of literally standing in the park with easels and chairs, makes people stop and ask, what's going on, what are you doing? And then when you start to talk about it, they say, you get down to the nuts and bolts, like Lisa was finding out, where the women were sort of caballed and challenging Lisa on, why was this cupboard here? Why do we need that cupboard? It's fascinating, but it was just, you are pushing against an open door because people just want to talk, and it's fascinating. And the other quality of Stamford Hill is that the suburban quality of Stamford Hill is its Victorian terraced houses, and you have a non-Jewish family living next to a Jewish family. Both houses look the same. Rich and poor people live side by side in the Heredia community because they valued the connection to their community infrastructure. Everyone has to be within walking distance of the synagogue or their kosher shops. You can be the richest person in Stamford Hill. You still live in a house next to a school teacher whose house has been bought by public subscription for them. And there's it's a great leveling feature, this need to be close to one another.
And can I pick up? I mean, I think it's really fascinating, that idea that as things become more suburban, your community become more, you kind of disappear. And I guess what I find in Stamford Hill, I mean, echoing Tom's thoughts, is that there's a real kind of urbanity about it, actually. And I think it's about a density of social infrastructure, because those things that are by necessity shared, as Tom's pointed out, the synagogue and the baker and stuff like that, they bring people sitting close together. So it's far more like a kind of the typical European city of our imagination, you know, where you come down from your apartment, you've got everything within 10 minutes walk. And that quality is really being lost. So even though high density developments are being built in London, they are high density in kind of physics, but actually in quality, they're suburban. They're just compacted sort of suburban developments. And so it's that lack of a kind of fulsome social infrastructure that makes them suburban. I mean, the other thing I mentioned is in Tower Court, there's a volunteer ambulance station. And it's sort of an example of this amazing self-help kind of ethos and this kind of confidence that Tom's alluding to. But I think there's this amazing urbanity set within this effectively suburban milieu, which is kind of off counter to the other direction which most developments are going in, which are essentially suburban.
So Adam, are you saying perhaps that this idea of urbanity comes from the sense of a community?
Yeah, and that density of proximity of uses, they're all within walking distance. I mean, what a telling measure that is, that you can find everything you need within. I mean, it's a kind of become an ideal right now, hasn't it, in the 15-minute walking city? But this is it, you know, and it therefore has this kind of quality of vitality. Actually, you know, you can stand there on a common, and before long you've got a crowd, an interested crowd. I mean, that wouldn't work in many contemporary so-called high-density developments.
I think its authenticity comes from the raison d'etre that all these people live close to each other. It's because they have to, just one of the interesting reason why Adam, Khan and Muff and we were encouraged by Hackney to be so thoughtful about this particular project is that Hackney are involved in a borough-wide estate regeneration project that's spanning 30 years. And they were finding that, and this goes for all communities, but the alienation they were causing with their estate regeneration schemes was becoming slightly catastrophic for them in a public relations sense. And each time they approached a new estate to broach the subject of its redevelopment, they were suffering massive backlash because all the residents were seeing was just high rise, you know, without any reason. And you can say all you like that we've got to put the density up to pay for this, to pay for your new flat. We've got to build 5 other new flats on this same site. Whereas here, the people were, you know, saying this is great. This is such a great. This is because we need to live here. So the densification had more than an economic rationale behind it. It was that the community were crying out for it, both non-Jewish and Jewish. I think that made for a very authentic urbanism that's more akin to the European, and certainly my experiences in Scandinavia and Neil Storp, and you know, from that Alvar Aalto and the humanistic city, you know, that just kind of comes naturally once you've got an actual reason for building in the way that Adam Khan was building.
Well, I think this issue of density is really interesting to take up. I mean, actually, Liza told me quite an interesting anecdote about density that she gleaned from the process of consultation that you had, and she was talking to some women in London, but they were mentioning how in Antwerp that some of the families use some of the housing that they're in has very tall spaces, so they actually use the upper part of the space as storage, and they store, especially for the big bicycles that they use to maybe take the children around the city, that they actually use that space as storage space. And I think this issue of density, you know, it transfers over into different urban situations. I mean, it manifests unusually in the suburban, but actually it's very much part of the central Jewish quarters that I think Alain you were talking about with the Diamond Quarter. I mean, is that something you recognise?
What Tom and Adam said made me think about two aspects. Like Tom said, it's actually for Haredi Orthodox Jewish community this suburban way of life is an impossibility. Suburban, like you said, only housing and nothing else, because Orthodox Jews have to live close to the synagogue, and they have to live close to their shops, and because on holidays they cannot take the car. So their whole life is based around a carless way of life, which is indeed something that the rest of the of the culture is now moving towards, and for them it's an evidence. So that's interesting in relation to density. The other thing, when you talk about moving up or raising density by building higher, this is also a complex issue for Orthodox Jews, because on the Sabbath you cannot take the elevator. So I'm working on a residential project in the Jewish quarter now, and you know, usually in a residential project, the higher you go, the more the apartment becomes expensive, because it has more air, more light, a nicer view. But when you're dealing with an Orthodox public, it's actually the opposite. The lower floors are more interesting because they don't want to go 6 flights up on Shabbat, because that's not convenient. So actually they prefer to live below instead of on top. You have this notion of Shabbos lift, where you can have an elevator that, in Israel they have an elevator that on holidays it goes up every floor without you having to push a button, and then you can just go in, and without you actioning anything, you can go up and then go down. It just takes a long time because it stops on every floor. But many Orthodox communities don't like that, because it's sort of a bending of the rule, which is obviously a Jewish speciality, to bend the rules, because otherwise your life becomes more or less impossible. So.
I mean, that's a great point, Helen, and I think that was in a way the next issue I wanted to talk about, was this issue of the rules, which I think Adam touched upon really nicely in talking about the space standards and the rules that he has to engage with building something in London, and the whole idea of how about how we engage with rules and how we manipulate them to serve our purpose. And I know that you've talked about that to me, whether you want to develop that idea.
Of the rules.
Yes, I mean, like in the way that Adam was talking about how he engaged the spatial rules in his development of the plans for Tower Court.
I find that, I mean, that whole concept of living with, of being able to live with, well, basically in the Torah, you have 613 mitzvot. So you have 613 things you have to do, and then you have thousands of things that you cannot do. And so it's endless. If you have to live by all these rules, it's a full-time occupation. You don't have time to actually work or do anything else. So so that has always fascinated me. When I once traveled, and then we stayed, my best friend is an Orthodox Jew, and we stayed with his brother, and on Shabbat, the rule is that you if you live in a city that is not walled, like Jerusalem was and like ancient cities were, then you cannot carry anything on Shabbat. It's not allowed because it's sort of, it's work. You're carrying something from one domain to another, and that's forbidden. So what his brother, so the problem is you leave your house for Shabbat, but you can't carry your key because you cannot take your key with you because it's something you carry. The only thing you can carry are your clothes. All the rest is forbidden. So he had this belt that was specially made for Orthodox Jews, where I don't know how you call it, the piece to close the belt, the buckle was a negative of a key. Was the negative of a key. So when he left his house, he closed this door and he had to put his key in the buckle to keep his pants up. And that way, the key becomes part of your clothing and then it's allowed. That's what you made me think of.
Is that helpful to you, Adam? Is this going to be a new design concept for you?
Yeah, absolutely. Solved it.
Just on the subject of rules, and so one of the most enjoyable parts of our process with Adam, Khan and Muff and Hackney was that you start to talk about what an Orthodox Jewish family need, and then to see another architect realize that that is an opportunity for design. So the courtyards are designed as compounds so that if people choose, that they can have their rabbi declare an Urev, which is the enclosure that you require to be able to carry things, so that at least mothers can then carry their children down on Shabbat. And then the other thing that is always fun to play around is the scattering of balconies across a building to create the sukkah with the sky above. So you don't get balconies on top of each other. You spread them out, and it makes a very playful gesture on what's a very controlled piece of architecture. And it's just that sort of slight anarchy that the Orthodox Jewish people have inside them, just being imposed on what would otherwise be a very, very controlled bit of high design.
I don't think anarchy is an interesting term, because I mean there is this idea about rules are there not to be negotiated with and discussed, aren't they? They're not there, you know. There's not one way of following a rule.
If you ask, so that my dad was told when he was struggling to design a synagogue as a non-Jewish person, as our family is not Jewish, and he said to the client in this case, please, you need to tell me what you want. And he said, do you know what, John? The trouble is, we've got 100 members of this synagogue. And do you know what that means? That means we have 100 experts in synagogue design. And then, you know, it's explained. And so Adam Khan met, I don't know, during the process, 1,000 people, and they were all experts on the rules, what Orthodox Jewish family need, and where it should be, how big it should be, what color should be, everything.
Quite a challenge.
But it's great. It's also because that's also a great leveler, isn't it? Because you get someone who may be shouting the loudest and kind of sounding the most, you know, authoritative about what something should be, and actually then you crack it open and you find there's 100 different other opinions. And I think that's really, really useful actually for an architect, but also for a kind of society to fun to work within, because actually I think some people can be too nervous about designing for other people, that they're, you know, they feel they have to be, you know, they're too frightened to ask questions or too frightened to say the wrong thing or be impolite or something like that. But actually just getting kind of stuck in and talking to lots of people breaks that down, and it breaks that kind of nervousness down, and then one can be bold and be confident. And I think in terms of the rules, I mean, our take on it, as said, is very much, you know, using those special needs not just to cater for those special needs, but using them as a kind of rock to crack open some very normative guides, so to enable, you know, generosity and flexibility. So yes, it will absolutely work for observance of the Heredia rituals, but actually those very same things will actually work for other things. And I guess that comes out of my experience of being in London and being from, you know, my dad was an immigrant, an outsider, and, you know, it kind of that wanting to de-exoticize the kind of these kind of special needs. You know, I always found it rather embarrassing when people would go on about Muslims requiring a toilet that faced Mecca or not faced Mecca or whatever like that. You know, I always found that was a bit kind of painful and embarrassing, whereas it's the kind of shared experience, the commonalities that are kind of more interesting. But as the Joyce quote, you know, those come out of the particular, not out of an approach to housing which is starts with the generic.
And I think that's a really good point now to turn to you, Kat, because you were telling us about architects who were Jewish designing housing. So in a way, it's the opposite side of the question. I mean, you mentioned Leon Fuchs in your talk, but I know you've got some very interesting stories about him and about his life as a child and how he survived the war and then his work. I wondered if you would share a few more of those with us in relation to what Adam's just been talking about.
Well, Fuchs was a one-box person. So he defined himself as being Belgian, Flemish, Antwerp, and Jewish, which nowadays seems like a very contradictory terms rolled all into one. But first of all, he saw himself as being an architect, and we found notes about this that he sort of wrote to himself, like manifestos that he wrote to himself, like, first and foremost, I'm an architect, and architecture is was his religion and his dogma. And he also used to work with all kinds of different clienteles. He enrolled in different religious communities. So he was betting on different horses, which is not really something that is usually okay. You choose or the Masika Hadas or the Homre Hadas or another one, but you don't enlist in all of them. But he did that for his architecture. I don't think he was one who was really listening to his clients. He was more of the old school the architect that decides and then implements, not really being receptive and listening to his clientele and their needs. That's not what he was about. And he also did not really appreciate all the different people from the synagogue coming to his to the building sites and to
the opposite to you.
No, he really did not appreciate that. He, in other notes that we found, because he was someone who was really very, very outspoken, and he really resented interference from all different people. He made a list like who not to work with. And at the top it was know-it-alls, experts of all sorts, religious people. So he had like this whole list, like, oh.
A true modernist.
Yes, stay away from. But yeah, a true modernist indeed. But he's a fascinating figure just because there is no labeling him. So we're treading very carefully in reconstructing his career and his profile, because every time when we think, oh, we have a little bit of frame to put him in, then we find something else that he himself puts him out. So
you know, that in itself is a kind of hiding, isn't it? Being part of lots of communities, or you know, it's a way of hiding himself. I mean,
I think in his case it was not really hiding. When he came out of the war, he, as an act of consciousness, he decided that he wanted to study architecture. He was 17 or 18 when he came out of the war, where he spent 3 or 4 years hiding. And when he came out, he decided to study architecture, and that he wanted deliberately leave all that behind. His parents and grandparents were religious people. He tore himself away from his religious background, and he wanted to reconstruct and construct a whole new and a better world. He was very idealistic about it, but also very down to earth. And he was not one who was himself hiding, because he was all over the place. He was member of every professional network in Belgium, and he was building tons of projects in Antwerp. We now found data on 300 projects, which is quite a lot for a 30, 40-year-old career. Mm-hmm. So in a time span. So he wasn't, and he taught at what is now Antwerp University, the formation of architects, but in his days it was still high school. It was an academic kind of situation. It was not university yet, but he was also a teacher, and he mingled with progressive artists of Antwerp. So he was present everywhere. But I think it's more the fact that architectural history is in need of readdressing or reassessing the canon, with the architects that we put into the canon, and they become a sort of common knowledge, and everything that falls out of it, people do not address in science and in scientific or academic myths, because there's not enough framework or content or theoretical framework. And I think with all the non-identical cases that science sort of doesn't know what to do with them, and that makes them invisible. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Interesting. Well, I think I've just got one more theme that we could discuss, I think, before we finish, and which I think everybody touched upon in their presentations, which is this dialogue or this tension between private space and public space or shared space. And I think this touches upon your research, Kat, I think, with your PhD in the interior. But also, I think that both Adam and Alain talked about a lot in their presentations about, this relationship between the street or the courtyard or the space that everybody can go into and the private space, and then what the spaces that are in between those two states. I'm wondering, do you find that you have a common? Do you think that you share a common attitude towards that, or do you think you have a different take on it? What, Alain, perhaps, what did you, when Adam was talking about Tower Court, how do you feel about that in relation to your argument that you presented on the Diamond Quarter?
You mean the courtyards in between the buildings?
They're very different, aren't they? There's a permeability between the block and the private space, and then the shared communal space.
Yeah, I think I understood that the whole purpose was to not make these courts private.
Yeah.
But I didn't quite understand, are they private property, or, are these courtyards actually private property, or are they public domain, Adam?
They'll be public domain. It's a project instigated and developed by the local authority, the local government. And I think what's surprising is that the most obvious thing would be that those courtyards were gated and secured. And if you think of the kind of hostility and threats that the Jewish community are under, that would have been obvious. That would have been obvious. And there are a lot of schemes, and a lot of schemes are still built with a kind of gated, locked courtyard. But obviously, we know how kind of destructive of kind of that is to have that. And then you pile on this kind of huge child density, so that these places want to be really playable. So it feels even more important that they're open and connected to the neighborhood. Therefore, they are places where Haredi meets non-Haredi, and as Tom was saying, rich and poor kind of rub shoulders together. So I think it's a very idealistic scheme. We really think it will work because of the attention to thresholds. So the normal argument against these being public is that anyone will just wander through there, or kids will go through on a motorbike and trash it. But I think the attention to the detailed design of thresholds means that the right signals are given, and the right sense of territory and ownership in the kind of psychological sense will be there. And I think it's also interesting that it feels like only a local authority like Hackney would do a scheme like this, because in a way, a private developer would just make a lot of money straight away if they just did a kind of exclusively Haredi development. It would sell, within 5 minutes, and everyone would be happy. So who are the people that are going to bring on mixed developments like this? And I really do actually. The only people I see doing it would be a local authority. Let's hope it works.
So just to finish off, a quick, more topical question. It's been in the newspaper a lot about how the coronavirus pandemic has affected more than the general population, the Jewish communities in Antwerp and London. And I'm wondering if you have anything to say about that.
Perfect Zoom environment. It's stuck on Zoom in the middle of a suburb, isn't it? So it's interesting that the whole direction of COVID proof is sort of anti-urban, anti-density in a way, isn't it? But that just applies everywhere.
I think that for any religious community, the pandemic has had a massive impact. You have here people that believe they are commanded by God to go to synagogue 3 times a day, You might be able to stop 5% of them doing that, but the rest of them will believe that the higher authority is that they go to shul and they pray and they study with their study partner, and social distancing, if you're trying to cram 100 people through a single door into a small synagogue, it's you know, it's not necessarily urban design. It's more the design of religious buildings. I think the schools in Stamford Hill closed, but the synagogues, whilst they were required to close by law, many did not. And I can't criticize the conduct of that community, because their belief system is so strong that I, you know, sincerely believe they felt they didn't have any choice. And so I don't know if there will be any lessons learned. I mean, ritual hand washing is part of daily Jewish life. So it's, you know, we have, as a nation, learned to wash our hands properly, but if you are in an Orthodox Jewish family, you're washing your hands, you know, many times a day in a very particular ritual way. But again, you know, facilities like mikvahs, I know of, you know, a few in Stamford Hill that just stayed open because the value that people place on that is more than the risk of being fined or catching coronavirus. And indeed, I don't know anyone in my non-Jewish life that caught coronavirus. I know tens of people that caught coronavirus and a few that died, unfortunately. One of whom will be remembered by a bench in Tower Court, I think, Adam, if I'm correct. So yeah, it's been very sad to see. And also the mainstream press really do love to, you know, needle this, well, any minority community, but and also non-Haredi Jewish people were highly vocal in their criticism of the people in Stamford Hill for the way they behaved. And I don't know if that's fair or not. So yeah, it's a very interesting thing.
In Antwerp, most of the synagogues adapted their ways of going of way of practicing religion. So there were a maximum of 10 people per so much square meter. So it was regulated. And there are many synagogues in Antwerp. There was only 2 incidents on one synagogue, but it's also because it's a difficult building. The building itself is composed of different rooms and different houses. So it's like a puzzle of different houses that became one synagogue. So the interpretation of the law was every different house can welcome a certain amount of people coming to synagogue, and then the police interpreted it the other way. So there was a gray area in that specific case. But apart from that specific case, the rest of the synagogues adapted to the rules implemented by the Belgian government. Another thing also is that in Belgium, you can live with your family. You can leave the house with your family. So mother, father, and the children, but many Orthodox families are big families. So when they leave the house, they're easily 10, 15 people. But a lot of people that are non-Jewish or non-Orthodox are not familiar with this family structure. So they easily, and this has got nothing to do with Jewishness or even migration backgrounds. I found that this whole COVID situation drives people to a state of mind of fear, where there's a lot of judging going on if someone is not wearing a mask or not washing their hands, and immediately there's 10 people playing the cop, like, oh, he's not doing it properly. So there's this driven by fear, people, I feel judge even more quickly than before. And it's the same with where we live. It's like a zone where Orthodox families live and also Moroccan families live, but those are big families. And it's a dense neighborhood with small houses with not so much public space. There's just one park nearby, and the park itself is not that big. So you can't ask people to stay in the house all the time. People and children need to be aired out at least once a day. So everybody gathers in the same park, and then there's this commentaries and judging but it's the fact that they have large families. That even has got nothing to do with religion. If you have a large family, you make a big group when you go out. So but we also had that. I have 4 children, and once I was on my bike with my children, and a lady came up to me and she said, you're too much, there are too many people. I'm like, but those are my kids. So yeah, I think the whole living in the city and the density and living in dense neighborhoods is very much under pressure to all this COVID situation.
I actually, I think, Adam, you said, well, the urban life has come under pressure during Corona because it's better to live outside the city with more open space and with a garden. And you're right, that's the common conclusion that most people draw. I live in the center of the city, and I find it to be just the opposite, because I know people who live in the suburbs and they haven't seen anyone for a year. They stay in their house and they have their garden, and that's it. While I go out every day, I jog in the park, I go buy groceries, and I see actually people I know in the neighborhood, friends, neighbors, and we talk on the street with proper distance. So, I pity the people who live in the suburbs because they haven't seen anyone for a year, and I have seen many people.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Okay, great. I think we've reached a conclusion. Thank you very much, everybody, for taking part in the conversation. It's really interesting to have these two sides: the Antwerp and London, Jewish architects building for a general community, architects building for a Jewish community. I think there's some really interesting issues have come up. So thank you very much.
At Brickworks Vande Moortel, we make high-quality bricks, slips and clay pavers in unique colours and sizes. To support architects around Europe and the UK, we created a brand new high-end brick lab, housing the latest in ceramic innovations. Built on more than 150 years of experience, we bring together tradition with the architecture of tomorrow. Every brick, slip and clay paver in our brick lab is part of a research and development program creating new knowledge and insights. Working together with architects, we can thus reach higher levels of sustainability, quality and circular solutions, combining them with the highest design standards of today. All this without losing our passion that we would love to share with you.